The House will please come to order. I would like to welcome everybody to the 29th day of the session, Tuesday, February 21st, 2023. Today in history. Today in history, on February 21st, 1900, a military funeral is held for Chief Washakie. Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Convening roll call for the 29th day, Tuesday, February 21st, 2023. Alamand? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Clouston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Haroldson? Harshman? Heiner? Henderson? Warnock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke?
Excused.
Nyman? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup?
Excused.
Oakley? Oakley?
Excused.
Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez-Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer?
Excused.
Strock?
Excused.
Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washut? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Zwanitzer Dan?
Excused.
Zwanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers?
Here. Yeah, Chief Clerk, please leave the roll open. Thank you. I would like to welcome Rabbi Moshe Halfon from Mount Sinai Congregation for our prayer of the day.
Hit the button. All right. Good morning, and I'm sorry that you're standing because today is going to be just a tad longer than tomorrow because I wanted to say a couple of words just to let you know, if you didn't know already. I'm the new rabbi. I started a year ago, moved here from California. No comments about the weather. Just so you know that the Jewish community has been part of Wyoming since the 1860s, since the railroads. It was the first settlement in Wyoming was right here in Cheyenne. They came with the railroad, and in 1915, they erected the first synagogue. There's a plaque down the street for where that building was. And our present building was built in 1949. So I'm proud that I'm honored to be here representing the Jewish community, representing the synagogue, and that we kind of add to the meaning of the word, the equality state. I'm going to today do a more normative kind of prayer, but in the coming days, and stick around tomorrow and the next day, rather than doing a prayer per se, I'm going to do a teaching from various places, rabbinic sayings like so-and-so used to say, so you'll enjoy a little of that. But today, this is a responsive reading we do in synagogue, but I'm substituting the word America for the word Jews, okay? I, the Eternal, have called you to righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have made you a covenant people, a light of nations. We are America, witness to the covenant between God and God's children. This is the covenant I make with you. I will place my wisdom in your midst and write it upon your hearts. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. We are America. Our law forbids the worship of race or nation, possessions or power. You who worship gods that cannot save you, hear the words of the Eternal One. I am the Lord, there is none else. We are America. Our teachers proclaimed this vision for the world: hate evil and love what is good. You can tell it's coming from the Bible, but I'm just changing a few words. Let justice well up as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob them. You shall not stand idle while your neighbor bleeds. Violence shall no longer be heard in your land, desolation and destruction within your borders. All your children will be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of your children. We are America, O God, when we are witnesses to your love and messengers of your truth. Thank you. I hope that was okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Alfon. Thank you. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So then they just go on. Was that one okay?
That was The House will please come to order. Not now. After this. I got a floor presentation. No. It is a great honor that we are joined today by Consul General Sylvain Faby of Canada. As Canada's Consul General in the U.S. Mountain West region, Mr. Faby oversees a team of 17 people who work in the 5 Mountain West states to strengthen regional trade and economic ties with Canada. Please help me in welcoming Consul General Faby to the House.
Thank you so much. Big thank you. So, distinguished representatives of the Wyoming legislature, I would like to thank you for this special invitation. It's both an honor and a privilege to speak with you today, and I am really grateful. Let me just start by saying that no two nations depend more on each other for their mutual prosperity and security than the US and Canada. You've heard it before, we're bound together not just by geography and history, but also by our values, our dedication to promoting freedom, opportunity, and an unshakable belief in the dignity of self-determination. Over the past century, together we built the North American economy and security apparatus into the envy of the world. And even as new threats, as you've seen, have emerged, we have showcased that we stand steadfast together in the face of threat to either nations. We are proud in Canada to count the United States as our #1 partner, ally, and friend. Canada boasts strong relationships with all 50 states of the Union, and Wyoming certainly isn't an exception to that. We are your #1 export market, and in 2021, Canada imported roughly $350 million US dollars in goods and services from Wyoming in 2021. That's a more than 70 million increase since the last time I spoke to you 2 years ago. Mind you, it was the COVID period, but nevertheless, it's preferable when it goes up than when it doesn't, I would say. And of course, that's not including the Canada's direct investment into the state of Wyoming. We have about almost 50 companies that we know of, Canadian-owned companies, that have open operations and created hundreds of jobs for Wyomingites. And in terms of two-way trade, the Canada-Wyoming relationship is worth more than $1.5 billion in terms of goods and services. No, in terms of goods alone, sorry. But as I hinted a moment ago, these numbers do not reflect the true depth and importance of this relationship, especially as we look ahead to an uncertain global future. Events of the past years have made it painfully clear that economic integration alone will not be enough to ensure that all nations behave in good faith towards one another. And because of this, it is increasingly important that we look to our partners and our friends as we work to solve the problems of the next century. As you will be aware, NORAD stands as the cornerstone of Canada's defense relationship with the United States, headquarters not too far from here in Colorado Springs. And we look forward to marking the 65th anniversary this year of our binational command later this year. NORAD is the only binational command in the entire world. There is none other. It's not just an alliance, it's a binational command. And we should be proud of that because we share the same geography, right? So, and Canada and the US are both Arctic nations, and we value our continued cooperation in the Arctic issues, including on security, of course, as we've seen lately, climate and environment, as well as infrastructure development. Canada and the US are both mining hubs, and you in Wyoming know a little bit about mining and its importance. And in fact, next week, I'll be participating in a roundtable in Denver on critical minerals, hosted by our friends at the Canadian American Business Council. And I understand we will have experts from Wyoming traveling to join us for those important conversations. The US and Canada share an interest in improving critical mineral security, especially after the events of this year and those who will be happening in the future, and ensure the future competitiveness of our country's mineral industries. Through the Canada-US Action Plan on Critical Minerals collaboration, we're advancing our mutual interests in securing supply chain for the critical minerals needed for our important manufacturing sectors, including communication technology, aerospace and defense, and clean technology. We are, as you know, also a breadbasket to the world. The rich farmland that stretches across this continent might very well be one of North America's greatest geopolitical strengths. And together we protect our watersheds and fields and forests to ensure their health, not just for this generation, but for those yet to come. But I'm not here today to make any specific ask or demand of all of you. I'm just here to reaffirm the bonds between our two countries and your state also, the bonds of friendship and partnership. And we're active in Wyoming in letting Wyoming know that Canada is your friend and your partner, as we know you are ours. In the spirit of friendship, I am also very much looking forward to participating in my first Cheyenne Frontier Days. The first year I was posted in this area was COVID. There was none. The following year it took place. I had to be in Canada for some sort of very important meeting. But this year, I'll be here. I have planned around Frontier Days because I really want to be here. It's a 2-hour drive from where I live, so that's good. And finally, I want to close by saying that if any one of you ever has concerns, questions, ideas that involve Canada, our office is always there as your first one-shot point of contact to have these discussions with you. Some of you are taking good advantage of that. We're in touch. We're together and discussing issues. So I want to reiterate the fact that we're here not just to promote Canada, but to hear your ideas and your concerns. So thank you very much for the great honor that you gave us today for being here, and have a great end of session today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Consul General Faby, for joining us today and working so hard to cultivate this important relationship. We wish you the best as you continue your mission to strengthen and grow Wyoming's trade with Canada. Thank you again. Chief Clerk, would you finish the roll call, please?
Banks? Bear? Byron? Harshman?
excused.
Locke. Northrup. Oakley. Storer. Strock. Swanitzer Dan. 61 present, 1 excused.
All right. Representative Nicholas, do you have a privilege?
Privileged. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you the doctor of the day. So this is Kim, used to be Nicholas, now she's married away, but Kim used to run around these halls when she was in her 6, 7 years old. Her father, my brother Phil, was in the legislature 24 years, and of that, about 12 of them were in the House. And so they were regular participants sitting up here in the rafters, hiding up and down, up in the tower. But please welcome Dr. Kim Nicholas.
All right. One other introduction, and then I'll do some more privileges. I'd like to introduce Jesse Driscoll, who's our page for the week. And Jesse is President Driscoll's niece. So please help me in joining and welcoming her. Let's see, Representative Brown,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Privilege of the floor.
please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome 2 individual students here from junior leadership of Laramie County, if they're still floating around. I've got Parker Karowitz from Central High School, and then Jasmine Becerra from Pine Bluffs. And again, they're here from junior leadership of Laramie County, so if we can welcome them right up there in the Northern Gallery.
Hey!
Thanks for being here.
Welcome to the House. Representative Berger, privilege,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Privilege of the floor.
please.
All right. So a long time ago, my dad came to this beautiful building and talks about it all the time. And Governor Clifford Hansen presented him with his Eagle Scout Award. And it was back in the 60s. My dad talked about this beautiful building that he loves so much. And anyways, it's his birthday today. He was born in 1950, and I just want to tell my dad's online watching. I want to wish him a happy birthday. Happy birthday to Jesse Berger. Anyways, have a great day, Dad.
Hey! All right, any other privileges? Doesn't look like it. All right, Journal Committee report.
Your Journal Committee reports that the Journal of February 17th, 2023 has been read and recommends that it be approved. Representatives Chestick and Ward.
Messages from the Senate.
Message 358. Mr. Speaker, the Senate did concur on House amendments to the bill listed below by the vote indicated. Senate File 43, EMS districts, ayes 20, noes 10, excused 1. Message 359. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 22, State Land Lease Deficiencies Cure Process. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 27, noes 1, excused 1, conflict 2. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 360. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 27, School Facilities Consolidated Remediation Schedule. Ayes 30, excused 1. Message 361. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 44, Road and Bridge Construction Alternative Contracting. Ayes 26, noes 4, excused 1. Message 362. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 101, Uniform Trust Code Amendments. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 30, excused 1. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 363. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 118, Volunteer Firefighter Pension Funding. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 27, noes 2, excused 1, conflict 1. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 364. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 127, Healthcare Facilities and Clergy. Ayes 30, excused 1. Message 365. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 165, Living Organ Donor Protection. Ayes 30, excused 1. Message 366. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 174, Homestead Exemption Amendments. Ayes 26, noes 3, excused 1, conflict 1. Message 367. Mr. Speaker, House Bill 180, Brucellosis Testing Notification Requirements. The House bill listed above passed on third reading in an amended form as follows by the vote indicated. Ayes 30, excused 1. The Senate respectfully asks the House to concur by adopting the listed amendments. Message 368. Mr. Speaker, the bill listed below failed to pass the Senate third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 31, BOCES as local education agencies. Ayes 14, noes 16, excused 1. Message 369. Mr. Speaker, the Senate appointed Senate conferees to meet with a like Committee Number 1 from the House on amendments to Senate File 51. The Senate conferees are Senator Scott, Chairman, Senator Ellis, Senator Landon. Message 370. Mr. Speaker, the Senate did concur on House amendments to the bill listed below by the vote indicated. Senate File 10, Licensed Professional Counselor Compact. Ayes 28, noes 2, excused 1. Message 371. Mr. Speaker, the Senate did concur on House amendments to the bill listed below by the vote indicated. Senate File 37, Podiatry, Medical Services, Medicaid. Ayes 22, noes 8, excused 1. Message 372. Mr. Speaker, upon reconsideration, the bill listed below passed the Senate on third reading by the vote indicated. House Bill 31, BOCES as local education agencies. Ayes 16, noes 14, excused 1. Message 373. Mr. Speaker, Senate File 9, Medicaid Coverage, Licensed Pharmacists. The Senate adopted the Joint Conference Committee Number 1 report on bill listed above by the vote indicated. Ayes 23, noes 7, excused 1.
Representative
Sincerely,
Larson
Ellen.
J. Oh,
Go ahead.
do you have more? Representative Larson JT, do you have a privilege?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Privilege of the floor.
Please.
Members, I'd like to introduce to you the members of the Wyoming Airport Coalition in our North Gallery. Thank you for everything you do for our state and our industries.
Welcome to the House. Chief, do we still have a few more messages, or did you finish? Okay, all right. Mr. Majority Floor Leader? We are at that order of business, and Mr. Majority Floor Leader, do you have a privilege of the floor?
No,
Okay.
but it's always a privilege, Mr. Speaker.
Reports from standing committees.
Senate File 113, sponsored by Senator Pappas. Architect Practice Act Amendments, an act relating to professions and occupations. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 7, Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions, to whom was referred Senate File 140 engrossed, Building Code Requirements, Refrigerants, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Chadwick, Harrelson, Harshman, Knapp, Newsom, Olson, Ottman, Wiley, Yin. Representative Olson, Chairman. Senate File 140, sponsored by Senator Pappas. Building Code Requirements, Refrigerants. An act relating to public health and safety. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 7, Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions, to whom is referred Senate File 140 engrossed, Building Code Requirements, Refrigerants, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation to do pass. Ayes, Representatives Chadwick, Harrelson, Harshman, Knapp, Newsom, Olson, Ottman, Wiley, Yin. Representative Olson, Chairman. Senate File 152, sponsored by Education, School Finance, Special Education Funding, an act relating to school finance. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 4, Education, to whom is referred Senate File 52 engrossed, School Finance, Special Education Funding, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that do pass. Ayes, Representatives Allred, Andrew, Berger, Brown, Klauston, Lawley, Northrup, Obermuller, Provenza. Representative Northrup, Chairman. Senate File 56, sponsored by Judiciary, prohibiting travel across private land for hunting purposes, an act relating to game and fish. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 1, Judiciary, to whom is referred Senate File 56, prohibiting travel across private land for hunting purposes, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Chestick, Crago, Harrelson, Nemec, Oakley, Provenza, Rodriguez-Williams, Washit. Noes, Representative Jennings. Representative Washit, Chairman. Senate File 96, sponsored by Water. Omnibus Water Bill Planning and Administration, an act relating to water development projects. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom is referred Senate File 96 engrossed, Omnibus Water Bill Planning and Administration, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation to do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Henderson, Larson, Nicholas, Sherwood, Stith, Walters, Zwanitzer. Representative Nicholas, Chairman. Senate File 120, sponsored by Senator Barlow, Restoration of Civil Rights, an act relating to crimes and criminal procedure. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 1, Judiciary, to whom is referred Senate File 120 engrossed, Restoration of Civil Rights, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation to do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Chestick, Crago, Harrelson, Jennings, Nemec, Oakley, Provenza, Rodriguez-Williams, Washit. Representative Washit, Chairman. Senate File 169, sponsored by Senator Hicks, State Shooting Complex Task Force, an act relating to the administration of government. Mr. Speaker, your committee number 9, Minerals, Business, and Economic Development, to whom is referred Senate File 169 engrossed, State Shooting Complex Task Force, respectfully report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Representatives Banks, Burkhart, Conrad, Heiner, Knapp, Larson, Lawley, Tarver, Western. Representative Burkhart, Chairman.
We're at that order of business of bills on 3rd reading and final passage. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the consent list consisting of the following Senate files: Senate File 21, Senate File 32, Senate File 58, Senate File 65, Senate File 66, Senate File 95, and Senate File 178.
The reading clerk will please read the bills on the consent list.
Senate File 21, sponsored by Transportation, high occupancy vehicle lanes, an act relating to motor vehicles being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 32, sponsored by Judiciary, prohibiting drones over penal institutions, an act relating to crimes and offenses being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 58, sponsored by Travel, Sutton Archaeological Site Administration, an act relating to state lands being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 65, sponsored by Senator Baldwin, compensation of local registrars, appeal. Repeal, an act relating to vital records being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 66, sponsored by Appropriations, School Capital Construction Funding, an act relating to school finance accounts being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 95, sponsored by Senator Ellis, Moon Landing Day, an act relating to legal time and holidays being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. Senate File 178, sponsored by Senator Boner, Mountain Lion Pursuit Seasons, an act relating to game and fish being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
Having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall these bills pass the House? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Sorry. Allemand? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Klauston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Haroldson? Harshman? Excused? Heiner? Henderson? Warnock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez-Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washut? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Swanitzer Dan? Swanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers?
Aye.
Harshman? Are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote? Vote closed. 62 aye. As for Senate File 21, are there any changes? Singh, aye to no. Penn, aye to no. Andrew, aye to no. Smith, aye to no. Slagle, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Strock, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Ward, aye to no. Haroldson, aye to no. Angelos, aye to no. Rodriguez-Williams, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Knapp, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Warnock, aye to no. Ottman, aye to no. Allemand, aye to no. Banks, aye to no. Locke, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 42 aye, 20 no. As for Senate File 32, are there any changes? Provenza, aye to no. Yin, aye to no. Andrew, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 59 aye, 3 no. As for Senate File 58, are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 62 aye. As for Senate File 65, are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 62 aye. As for Senate File 66, are there any changes? Jennings, aye to no. Smith, aye to no. Slagle, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Strzok, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Penn, aye to no. Knapp, aye to no. Allemand, aye to no. Pendergraft, aye to no. Storr. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 51 aye, 11 no. As for Senate File 95, are there any changes? Warnock, aye to no. Penn, aye to no. Slagle, aye to no. Strzok, aye to no. Heiner, aye to no. Rodriguez-Williams, aye to no. Allemand, aye to no. Locke, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 54 aye, 8 no. As for Senate File 178, are there any changes? Harshman, aye to no. Walters, aye to no. Nyman, aye to no. Chestick, aye to no. Provenza, aye to no. Yin, aye to no. Nicholas, aye to no. Brown, aye to no. Further changes? Henderson, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 53 aye, 9 no.
Having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate Files number 21, 32, 58, 65, 66, 95, and 178 have passed the House. We are now at that order of business of bills on third reading and final passage, the regular list. The first bill for our consideration is Senate File 16.
Senate File 16, sponsored by Transportation, State Employee Moving Expenses, an act relating to the administration of government being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
We have amendments. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File number 16. Members, what this does is puts a cap on the moving expenses at $5,000. Those of you that have been involved with moving and paying for moving for employees know that this can become very, very expensive, depending on how you define moving expenses. And in the bill, it doesn't really define moving expenses. It says it shall pay for the actual expenses of transporting the household goods and effects of the employee. So the average cost for actually transporting the household goods is about $5,000, about $4,900. But then you can add on to that whether you have that moving company pack your goods and unpack your goods, and store your goods for, let's say, 30 days once you get to your new city of employment. But I have personally experienced moving costs that range from $30,000 to $60,000 per employee. This can quickly get away from the state as we allow these moving costs to be uncapped. And there's not very well defined in the bill what those moving costs are. In my employment, we found that we had to put a cap because it got to be very, very expensive. When you bring somebody in and pay that kind of cost to move them, it becomes counterproductive. Now, don't get me wrong here. In order for our departments to be successful, they need to be able to set up the chessboard. They need to be able to move people around to where they are most effective. And sometimes that's for the benefit of the employee, but most of the time it's for the benefit of the department. So we can't reasonably put a burden on the employee to move to a different spot in the state where it's going to benefit the department without being compensated adequately. But we got to make sure that this doesn't run away from us. And that's why I'm proposing to put a cap of $5,000 such that it would reasonably cover some of the expenses, but it won't get into the $30,000 or $40,000 range. So I urge you to vote aye on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Brown for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say on and against the amendment, and mainly for one reason, and that is we've got to have a little bit of trust in our executive branch to do what's right. We come down here, we're here for 30 days or 60 days when you include all the weekends in it. Once every other year, we're down here for a big, long session like this, and we kind of get the idea that we want to start micromanaging the executive branch to the nth degree. And while there's some purpose to that, and I think that we have a good value to that, I think at this point, after especially hearing the testimony in committee, which I would encourage anybody, if you're worried about the runaway prices, that's exactly what my concern was when I brought this bill out. You know, I don't want to see $20,000, $30,000 brought in for this either. But that's where we have the department that handles our administration and the information, and they're going to be the ones that administer the rulemaking for this. And they're going to be the ones that set the parameters for this. This is not just a fly-by-night issue, and we need to remind the entire body that we actually had this authority up until 2016, and it wasn't an issue within. We didn't have a myriad of issues happening with it. It was cut because there was a discrepancy in who believed whether or not we actually had the authority to pay for the moving expenses. All we're trying to do is codify what had happened back in 2016. It didn't occur for those next 6 years because, well, frankly, we didn't have the money, and this was not something that the directors were willing to part with on a discretionary basis. We were cutting positions, we weren't adding new positions, and certainly having a hard time recruiting, getting employees in here. So I think the 5,000 seems to be, I mentioned the 5,000 on the floor, and it seems to be that that's a decent number to talk about. But what happens if we have, somebody that hits 7,500, and that's the determination of whether or not we get that amazing candidate? And that amazing candidate decides to not come because they're not going to pay $2,500 out of their pocket to come take a job. And maybe it was even offered by the chief executive for a directorship or something along those lines. And that high quality employee decides not to come because they may be taking a pay decrease for coming to work for the state and do this. So I'm on and against. I appreciate the intent. I do think that we need to trust our executive branch leaders a little bit here. The one that sits in the office right below us here certainly garnered a heck of a lot more votes than the rest of us. And the people he puts in charge are the ones that we write the bills for, and they have to interpret, and they're accountable to the chief executive. So on and against.
Representative Davis for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, my concern still is with the financial note on that. So my concern, I guess, is that how we're using the 100 series. You know, if this isn't a line item on that 100 series, then we're using funds that are set aside for something else. So it seems like it's indiscretionary spending at this point. So if we put a cap on this, I think that's a very positive thing, but I'd also like to see a number in that budgetary form of what they think or anticipate, not just taking money from, as was discussed earlier, from a position that isn't being filled and utilizing that funds for something. It just doesn't seem to make sense there, but on the amendment.
Representative Penn for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in support of this amendment. I think that we do have a duty to be responsible stewards of the taxpayer dollar. At the same time, we want to be realistic and reasonable with these positions, and if it is deemed helpful for hiring purposes or when someone's transitioned to another location, and maybe that isn't a new job or something that they've applied for, then I think that's reasonable to consider assisting them. But I do think that we need a cap. Within my own county, I know of 2 families who have been relocated at taxpayer expense. One was given $40,000, and it was basically, they didn't do anything to move themselves. The moving company came in and did everything. Another was $20,000 to move from one county to another, and they opted to just take the money and move themselves still. And so I think that we need to be reasonable. We need to remember where the money is coming from. And I think that this finds a good balance. So on and for, thank you.
Representative Rodriguez Williams for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and for the amendment, I too echo the previous representative's concerns. And my number one concern about the bill is that moving expenses isn't adequately defined in the bill. However, I appreciate that the amendment does put a cap. Moving can be really expensive. This is the people's money that we're using here. And I know if I were to be relocated, Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of stuff. I've got fine china that needs bubble wrapped and boxed. I've got livestock. There's really no sideboards on this, and so I appreciate the cap and on and in support of it.
Representative Ward for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our body is constitutionally entrusted with appropriating funds, and indeed it is our duty to micromanage the executive when it comes to taxpayer funds. So I am on and for this amendment.
Representative Hornock for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think there's one thing we're forgetting about this when we're looking at the cap. I think the cap is a great idea, but the people that are going to move to Wyoming are going to move not because they get moving expenses. We're all here for a reason. I stayed for a reason. And we're forgetting about how great it is to live in Wyoming and the other benefits associated with Wyoming. I think if somebody, like the example that was used previously of if somebody's $2,500 short in their moving expenses, I think if they make the decision over $2,500 to move to Wyoming or not, or to move to a certain place or not in Wyoming. If that is the determining factor to the reason why somebody moves or not, that person probably isn't going to stay very long. So we're probably going to lose that employee anyway, if that's really what we're using to draw them here. There are good reasons to move to Wyoming. It's a great state to live, and we're forgetting about those benefits in this as well. I think this is a great idea to cap this. Thank you.
Representative Ottman for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to reiterate the past speakers, really, in my county, it is such a beautiful county. I mean, it's just wild and it's vast, but I also know that we got over 50 inches of snow, and a lot of people said, oh my goodness, when I moved here 2 or 3 years ago, I had no idea. So for people to have a little bit of skin in the game, to do some research and stuff is always a wise thing. And also, it has been proven again in our families, or at least mine, and over the course of time, whatever you set a limit at, if there is no limit, it will be met. So to save $5,000, that's a good thing, because then people will shop around to get the best thing. And we want people to come. We sure do, and we want to be a help. But $5,000 is not a drop in the bucket. It is very reasonable. Thank you.
Chairman
Aye on the
Zalmanson for
amendment.
your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Against the amendment, I would say $5,000 really isn't reasonable for what we pay in the private sector. We probably already spent more than $5,000 debating this amendment at this point. But anytime we put a number in statute is a really bad idea, because then again, in a future legislature, you'll have to come in, and there's already sideboards in this bill, right? You have to have the head of the department, you have to have the head of A&I agree to it. You already have 2 levels of bureaucracy. We had a dynamic discussion on our investment funds people and how we're trying to get them to move to Wyoming and leave, states in the East Coast that pay better. And, you try to offer somebody who lives in the big city $5,000 to relocate here, and that is part of the package, right? We're trying to convince people, these high-end people, to come to our state. They may just laugh at us and say, hey, if you're not even willing to pay for my relocation expenses to come to your state and try to make you, a couple $100 million, it's not even worth considering, right? We offer full compensation packages, full enticement offers for quality people to come to a company. And we're no different. We're based with the board of directors of a company for all of our state employees when it comes to compensation packages, when it comes to retirement pay. All of those things get lumped in together on how we treat our employees and what kind of employees we want in Wyoming. And so certainly that $5,000, as I heard from almost everyone, is probably not enough to cover adequate moving expenses. Certainly not in my community with a military base, on what it costs if you go down the street and talk to them, what it costs to move military members around at change of duty stations, way more than $5,000. So I would resist the amendment. $5,000 certainly isn't enough. And I don't think we want to put a third layer of bureaucracy on something that already has 2 different protection points on it.
Anybody else for their first time? Representative Tarver for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, I'm on and for the amendment. At least this gives us a starting point. If we need to adjust it, we can later. But without this amendment, I'm definitely a no vote on the bill. Thanks.
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the bringer of the amendment? Representative Heiner, bring us home.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to bring us home. So we heard some different comments. I want to address a couple of those. One of those was about micromanaging the executive branch downstairs. Well, members of this body, why do we have a budget? Couldn't we say we're micromanaging our chief executive by providing a budget for him? That's because we are the appropriators. That's our primary responsibility as a legislature. We have control of the state's money, the people's money. And by putting a budget out there, we kind of give direction. You can work within this budget, spend what's necessary, but don't go over or exceed the budget. And that's what this amendment does. It says, okay, you're trying to hire someone, you deal with the pay. Next, you're probably going to deal with vacation time, whether they're remote workers or not. but also compensation as far as moving expenses. I can tell you from experience, if we don't put a cap on this now, in the future, we're gonna wish we had, or we're going to come back and have to do it. Because this happened in my experience. We didn't have a cap, and it quickly got up to $45,000 to $60,000 per employee. And it's hard to get that payback. It takes a number of years to get that payback. Maybe you do have an amazing candidate out there that you want to hire, but are you willing to spend $60,000? Do we have enough in our budget to spend $60,000 on just relocating them? They have to want to come to work for us. We can't just put golden handcuffs on them and drag them into our state unless they want to come. So I think the $5,000 is reasonable. If we need to adjust it in the future because it's not working, we can easily do that. But I think we need to have some sideboards from the get-go here. So I urge an aye vote for this and call for the question. Thank you.
Question having been called, all those in favor of third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 16 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Chair is in doubt. All those in favor, please rise. All those opposed, please rise. All right, thank you. Third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 16 has failed 30 to 31. We have amendments. Representative Smith.
All righty, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 16 and ask for your favorable consideration. This amendment doesn't put a specific dollar amount onto the bill, but what it does do is put some sideboards up that basically it cannot exceed what that position pays during its vacancy. So if the position had only been vacant for 1 month and paid X amount, then it cannot exceed that amount. But if the position had been vacant for 10 months, then there is a lot more funds available for moving expenses. So that is, so based on the position and how much it pays will determine how much funds are available.
Representative Provenza for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a quick question for the bringer of the amendment. I see that we delete after employment, we're inserting a period. So it's ending with, that's page 2, line 15, employment period, and then we strike the rest of the line 16, 17, and we insert this new language. Does that, and then we have at the end vacant position only, I guess maybe I have answered my own question. I thought maybe we forgot to delete line 18. So I apologize, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Well, Chairman Brown, we've answered that question. Chairman Brown.
Well, that was fun, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, the first time I read this amendment, I kind of looked at this and I thought, this is exactly what I had been talking about, and what was portrayed to us is that this could be 100 series moving expenses. You would have this as any time that the position was open for 4 or 5 months, you'd be able to utilize those extra funds going for this. I think in theory, this works. What I'm concerned about is the way that it gets put into practice. And the way I see this being put into practice is if we have a position that we know we really have somebody that's highly qualified for, let's say they're in the northern part of the state and they've been sitting in that position for, let's use the department that oversees our roads, and let's say they have an engineer up in their District 4 office up in the Tetons here, and that particular individual is very highly qualified and probably the next in line to become the chief engineer here in the city to oversee the entire state. And the position hasn't been open for a month, but he's clearly the most qualified, or she is the most qualified candidate to take that position. And his ability or her ability to actually make the move is dependent upon the ability to receive moving expenses, which is actually exactly what we're trying to fix right now, is we have highly qualified employees that are trying to move up the ladder, but they simply cannot dig into their pockets to spend $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 out of their own pockets to take a paycheck increase that might be $4,000 or $5,000 a year. So the payback, the return on their investment in investing into the state is certainly not going to be as quick. So I have a little bit of reservation with that. I do appreciate the bringer of the amendment bringing this forward, because this is exactly what we did here in committee, is that this could likely be that portion. The other thing that this could be would be 900 series. And for those of you who don't know the 100 through 900 series, 900 is contractual agreements. And so, you know, instead of it being 100 series and paying for it out of there, this mentions nothing about 900 series, and the agency director could go in and hire a contractor to move the person, and it would not even be in the 100 series. So again, I just urge the body to trust our executive branch. This is not something that they're going haywire on and trying to just spend all the money in the world to try to move people around. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're just trying to get good qualified employees here. And if they need the moving expense help, we're offering it. It's not something that's being guaranteed to every single person that applies for a job across the state. So I'd urge caution on this one. I understand where they're coming from, but personally, I don't. Not going to vote for it. Thank you.
Representative Pendergraft for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and for the amendment, against the bill. We need to put some sideboards on this, which is why I'm for this amendment. I would be for most amendments. We got some sage advice when we started this session from a legislator who pointed out that if we get to the third reading of a bill and it's amendment after amendment, it's probably not ready for prime time. When I first was exposed to this bill, I read it and I thought, this is just kind of open-ended. I heard testimony in committee and felt very much the same way. I did not feel comfortable that this was something that we had any idea what the expense might be. And I might add one final note that during the 10 years that I served, I was moved many times at government expense and also witnessed many other moves at government expense. And I found any number of ways that that system was manipulated to cover all kinds of expenses not foreseen. So again, on and for the amendment, against the bill.
Representative Stiff for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, on and against the amendment. The problem with the amendment, I think, is that it creates a perverse incentive for the agency director to keep the vacancy open longer. So if the vacancy is open for 1 month and it's a $5,000 per month position, then it would authorize $5,000 of moving expenses. But if it's open for 4 months, then you can pay $20,000. We get a vacancy list that's prepared by the agency that deals with our administration and information. And that vacancy list shows that there are about 1,400 vacancies in state agency positions. Some of those vacancies are really old, 30 months, for example. So you have an odd situation where a person the director may want to hire someone, but this gives them an incentive to hire them, keep the vacancy open longer. So I think it doesn't quite achieve the purpose that it intends to achieve. So on and against.
Representative Heiner for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for the good bringer of this amendment. He's deleting some of the things on page 2, but one of the lines on 17 and 18 specifies that that paragraph only applies to employees of the Department of Transportation. Is that deleted? Because the paragraph before, Romanet I, says that they shall pay actual expenses, and in Romanet II, it says they may, and this right now provides just for the Department of Transportation. So I'm a little confused by the differences between state employment. If you work for this department, you shall be paid for moving expenses. If you work for this other department, you may be paid some other amount. So it's not clear there, and just trying to understand what this amendment does with that last line. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time? Chairman Brown for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll go ahead and answer the question for my committee member up here as far as the YDOT versus the non-YDOT and all that. If you remember, long time ago, we actually adopted a standing committee amendment that actually took out the moving expenses being exclusively for the Department of Transportation. This does become statewide for all agencies to utilize. So that is all taken care of. And then as far as the may use and the shall use, I can explain that again, just so we make sure everybody's underneath the same standing. That if an employee is living, let's say, in Sheridan, and the director of the Department of Family Services says, you must come down and now work in the Cheyenne office, this is where that position is going to be housed. This requires the state agency to pay for those moving expenses if it's moved at the discretion of the director for the benefit of Wyoming. The may clause in this is for the director that if he or she finds that attractive candidate that is the person that they really want, but they can't afford to make it, they have this tool in their tool belt to lure that particular person into the agency. So that's, I hope that clarifies the question from the good representative over on the southwest side of the state. The other thing that I would say on this, and another reason that I think I'm against this, is something that was similarly stated by our Speaker Pro Tem, but it's not just this individual position that's open, right? These agencies move and sway positions constantly that may have, an extra amount of $4,000 a month, or they could have some that have, $12,000 a month, depending upon the ranking of that position. And so with all that extra money sitting there for all of these positions open is where they would attempt to dive into. They would not go in and look at that one particular position in that 100 series and say, this is how much was line itemed to that position. They would look at their 100 series as an entire budget item. And they would say, hey, look, we've got X amount available in this. We've had these 6 or 7 positions open. This is why we want to utilize this particular funding to pay for this person to move. So I understand the intent behind this, and I recognize it, but I do think, again, I'm going to lean back onto my agency directors that they're highly qualified. They know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They're not going to abuse this system. I would ask that we as a body trust the employees that we are paying to take, I've heard it a whole bunch that we owe it to our taxpayers. So do they, and they recognize that. I firmly believe in our state agency directors, and I firmly believe that they will not abuse this power. So on and against, and I hope we can pass this bill to get those good employees into our state. Thank you.
Anybody else for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All righty. This just gives you another opportunity to vote if you want sideboards to limit the cap on how much can be spent. This is very flexible, and so I just ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 16 signify by saying aye. All those opposed? No. Third reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 16 has failed. One more amendment. Representative Rodriguez-Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 3 to Senate File 16 and ask for your favorable consideration. Essentially what this amendment does is on page 2 after line 18, it inserts language that would require the quote officer or employee to repay all expenses if the employee does not retain residency in Wyoming for 2 years after the expenses are paid and the employee does not remain employed with the agency for that period of time. As you know, we several weeks ago dealt with House Bill 24, which talked a lot about state investments, compensation, and relocating employees for the agency that our executive branch. And in that bill, there was lots and lots of sideboards in it. And Mr. Speaker, what this does is this gives another option to the current bill that we're debating and really give some accountability to those that we're relocating. And so I would just urge an aye. I vote.
Representative Hornock for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I would recommend an aye vote on this. We did debate this pretty heavily when debating House Bill 24. Go back and take a look at that. We put these kind of sideboards on that for that organization, and I think it's reasonable to do the same across the board. Thank you.
Representative Newsom, Chairman Newsom for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a question for the bringer of this amendment. In the past, not too long ago, we had layoffs, significant numbers of layoffs. And so if there is someone hired, moved, we pay the expenses, and yet they get laid off through no fault of their own. Where does that leave them in this situation? Thank you.
Representative Henderson for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and against the amendment, I do have a question. It's kind of related to the last one, but it's a little different. Is that, life circumstances change, and so how would this work in a situation where it makes sense to the individual, to consider other opportunities and move on within the time frame specified?
Representative Heiner for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the body, this is a common clause in private practice. I've seen it in every moving package in all of my employment with various numbers of companies. It's always included that if you leave the company before a certain amount of time, you have to pay back all or a portion of that moving expenses. So I think this is a great idea. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Walters for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and against the amendment. Really in the situation of the previous House bill that was discussed, that was when we're recruiting people to the state and we want to retain them in the state of Wyoming. In this situation, if we move, for example, a corrections officer from one institution to another institution, and then they go to work for the local sheriff's department, that's still a positive benefit to the state of Wyoming. And expecting them to pay back those moving expenses really doesn't make sense in that situation, because Wyoming as a whole is still better off because those folks are still here in the state of Wyoming. And so again, on and against the amendment, and thank you for your time.
Chairman Zwanitzer for your
Thank
first time.
you, Mr. Speaker. sadly against the amendment. I think the intent is good. The issue with the amendment is it says you have to stay in Wyoming and be a Wyoming resident. We don't actually have that provision, and we've done research over the last decade that we can't put in that provision without a constitutional clause like Colorado has, where to work for the state, you have to live in the state. Here in Wyoming, we don't restrict, as far as I know, anywhere else, you having to live in the state of Wyoming as part of that amendment suggests. And so, as I think we all know, Teton County, many of our state employees live in Idaho. Goshen County, many of our state employees live in Scotts Bluff who work at that correction facility. And I think a lot of where this amendment, where this bill is going, deals with our Department of Corrections and that institution where many of our state employees actually live in our neighboring state to the east. Many, I shouldn't say many of our state employees, but certainly some of our state employees here in Laramie County live to the state to the south, and many of the university employees live in the state to the south. And so this does seem to be an unfairness, but I guess it would work if that's part of the contractual obligations that you have to live in Wyoming. I just think it sets a disparity between what we what would have for every other employee in that department, and on this payback that it requires you to be a resident of the state when we don't have that requirement anywhere else. And so for that portion of the amendment, I think the 2-year payback's great. I just think the residence requirement to be in the state of Wyoming is problematic.
Anybody else for their first time? Representative Chairman Olson for your first time.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. If thinking about this amendment, I'm going to push back for a little bit of a different reason. If this has already been said, I apologize for that. But I think this locks in we're looking at it from one perspective of what if the employee finds that life changes and it makes sense for them to leave. But I also think about it in the reverse. What if the employer, was this already said? Okay. But what if the employer changes their mind and it's best for the employer to go ahead and terminate that relationship? That's going to cost the state money. So I think it locks us in from both perspectives, particularly negative in both aspects. And I would urge a lot of caution on this amendment.
Representative Pendergraph for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and for the amendment and against the bill. I want to reiterate the comments I made on the last amendment. Here we are, and it seems like every one of us looked at this bill and says, well, it's got a little, let's tweak it here, let's tweak it there. And then there's an issue with the tweak. This bill is not ready for prime time. I certainly will not vote for it, probably even with the amendment, which I do encourage you to add.
Anybody else for their first time? Chairman Eklund for your first time.
Mr. Speaker, I guess I'd bring up that we have worked the bill for years. I don't know how many, but a lot. It's been worked quite a bit. On this amendment, I'm curious how it would be enforced and what kind of a mechanism you would have to do that if somebody took the moving expenses and then moved out of state. Would we send the police after them, or what would we do?
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Rodriguez Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, just urging an aye vote on the amendment. Just to answer a few questions that have been brought up and concerns. I've had several family members that have been relocated across country in the private sector to work for big energy companies, and the cost of moving is very, very expensive. And there's buy-in when in the private sector when relocating happens. There's buy-in from the future employee. As far as, the word layoff was used, it was my understanding that those were all step 1, 2, and 3 reductions that occurred. And as far as life circumstances that happen, if you agree to be relocated across country or to our great state, that's just life. There's life things that happen, and there's things that change. And when you sign up to be relocated, you, in this case, if the amendment were to pass, you're you're taking a risk essentially, not only to pack up and move to our great state, but also to potentially have to pay back the moving expenses, which at this point, there's no cap on. I'd also like to draw your attention to the bill that we passed, House Bill 24, and looking at page 3, lines 12 through 15, Romanet.
Representative Rodriguez Williams, we're going to stick on this bill.
Okay, I just wanted to, Mr. Speaker, there was a discussion or concern about constitutionality, and I just want to address a previous bill that was passed that used this language in regards to relocating to live and establish residency in Wyoming. In that bill, House Bill 24,
Not
there's
that.
language.
Please don't repeat bill numbers.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we have used this language in a past bill. And so again, I urge an aye vote on this amendment. Again, we're dealing with taxpayer money. I think that it's pretty reasonable that if you're not gonna stay in a position for at least 2 years, that you would have the decency to repay the state. Thank you.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 3 to Senate File 16 signify by saying aye. All those opposed? Third reading amendment number 3 to Senate File 16 has failed. Division having been called, all those in favor, please rise. Thank you. All those opposed, please rise. Thank you. Third reading amendment number 3 has failed, 28 to 33. Senate File 16, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Ellerman? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Klauston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Haroldson? Harshman? Heiner? Henderson? Hornock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? I'm sorry, Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stiff? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washut? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Zwanitzer Dan? Zwanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers? Heiner, can you repeat? Heiner, aye. Are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote? Vote closed. 33 aye, 29 no.
Senate File 16, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate File 16 has passed the House. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 38.
Senate File 38, sponsored by Senator Schuler. Special license plates, organ donations. An act relating to motor vehicle license plates being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
We have an amendment. Representative Smith.
All righty, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 38 and ask for your favorable consideration. Basically, during our testimony during in the Transportation Committee, I was made aware that the license plate fees for our veterans is more than this fee, and I just didn't want to see the fee be less than what we would charge our veterans. So this just adds a $20 fee to the county to bring it up to the same price that we charge our veterans.
Anybody else for their first time? Chairman Brown, for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't necessarily disagree with the $20 fee going in on top of this. I'm trying to find in our wonderful data book, the fund that the good representative is mentioning comes from, there's an additional amount of money that goes to the Veterans Commission. And that amount of money is then put in, and I believe it's called their canteen fund, if I remember correctly. And when the veterans license plate was originally adopted, and that's, I did bring this up in committee as well as out here on the floor, that this is just a choosing of a plate. It's not going to be anything extra. There's a $30 fee associated with it to buy this additional plate, but this is what we would call basically a vanity plate. The additional $20 going into the county general fund, if the body wants to do that, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to make sure that the body understands that the $20 that the veterans license plate came from, that was requested at the time by those requesting that plate. And that was because that amount of money was being pulled into a canteen fund, which supports different programs and different opportunities for veterans throughout the state. And so the Veterans Commission utilizes that money for different purposes out there. This $20 going straight to the county general fund, probably not going to amount to much for the amount of plates that are going to get sold, but I just a little bit of education more than anything, not either for or against the amendment. Thanks.
Representative Pendergraft for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and for the amendment. The only reason I don't have a veterans plate on my car is because they want an extra $30 to do it. And I don't think that's there. And this to say about that regarding license plates, this is nothing new. We keep getting hit with, how about this plate? How about this plate? How about this plate? And I guess for my part, we've got the entire rest of our vehicle to support or defend any program thing that we want to do. And I've come to the point where I'm done. I'm no on the bill.
Representative Berger for your first time on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not for this amendment. This is a bill from a young man in our area in Southwest Wyoming who wanted to create awareness and feel purpose in his life. And I just don't want to add any extra more money to this. And there's not very many plates right now that are going to be sold, and I don't see it as a necessary cost for us to give an extra $20 for this plate. And let's support this young man and help him give him the reason why he was given his heart, and the person next to him was not. And this is how he feels why he was given this heart, and let's give him that sense of purpose. So I'm against this amendment.
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the sponsor? Chairman Brown for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just wanted to correct myself. I did find where this is at. It is underneath the Veterans Affairs Commission. It's Fund 588. There's about $260,000 in there, and this is used to deposit commission, cemetery, museum donations, cemetery burial reimbursements, and commission license plates and emblem sticker sales. So, you know, I understand the intent of trying to make everything equal, but I want to make sure that it's, and I'm going to go ahead and say I'm on and against this amendment strictly because the $20 that's additional to this particular plate is just going to go to the funding of government. And I don't think that that's really what we want to do. The $20, it's an assistance on the veterans plate goes to our veterans, and they requested that. And that was when that bill was passed my first year in. So I don't want to tack on another $20 just to tack on another $20 just to fund county government. So on and against.
Anybody else for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please vote aye.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 38 signify by saying aye. All those opposed? No. Third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 38 has failed. Senate File 38, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Allemand? Allred? Andrew? Angelos? Banks? Bear? Berger? Brown? Burkhart? Excused? Byron? Chadwick? Chestick? Clauston? Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Harrelson? Harshman? Heiner? Henderson? Warnock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermuller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washut? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Swanitzer Dan? Swanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers? Are there any changes? Harshman? Excused to aye. Heiner? Aye to no. Further changes? Further changes. Closing vote. Vote closed. 36 aye, 25 no, 1 excused.
Senate File 38, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate File 38 has passed the House. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 61.
Senate File 61, sponsored by Management Council. Legislator per diem, an act relating to per diem rates being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 61 and ask for your favorable consideration. So members, during these past couple of readings, I think we heard some concerns over whether it is necessary spending for some members. Some members have said that they didn't think that they needed this amount of money, and so this provides a way for them to automatically opt out when, without hurting our boards and commissions. It still keeps everyone still eligible for the per diem. All it does is say that they need to opt back in after, if they decide that they so need that increased rate. But I think during the discussion, many of us know that the per diem doesn't cover everything, so I just want to make sure that everyone still has it, but some people who don't feel it's necessary for themselves can still elect not to have it. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hornock for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I might be in favor of this because it sets a precedence for what we're doing here. We will essentially do something with our reimbursement and set a precedence for the rest of the state employees. If we offer them a raise and they don't take it, or they can, they can take it or not. We offer them a per diem. They can take it or not. We offer them moving expenses. They can take it or not. And we get them on the record saying so. I think this is a good idea. Why not vote for it? Thanks.
Chairman Harshman, could you come here to the mic, take my spot?
Speaker Summers, for your first time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you on and against the amendment, and probably on and against all of the amendments. We've struggled over the course of time to pass a per diem bill out of this body, and rightfully so. We have to gauge whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. And I know I need to stay on the amendment, but I think this is an opportunity we have. Maybe doesn't come back again for another 4 or 5 or 6 years. So if you don't want a per diem bill, load it up. Get all the amendments on it you want. But if you want a per diem bill, keep it simple. On and against.
Representative Heiner, first time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I read this amendment earlier this morning, I wasn't sure what the intent was here. What it does, I think, Mr. Speaker, I think it further divides this chamber. I don't think this is a good deal. I think it'll be the haves and the have-nots. And I think we don't need to further divide the chamber. So on and against this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Henderson for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Frankly, I'm for the bill and against all the amendments too. I've been here for 6 years, 7 if you talk to some folks. Depends on where you start and stop. But you know what? It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about the people who want to be you and me, who may want to serve. It's about the people who are going to be benefited, who are just making it, payday to payday, just getting by. I don't think that applies to us, most of us. We already have a mechanism for opting out. I think this amendment in and of itself is unnecessary. And if I know I can tell you that I'll save a lot of time if this goes down. But on and against this amendment for the bill, I think it's time that we do the right thing for the right reasons, for the right outcome, for Wyoming.
Representative Trujillo for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In very many places of employment, your per diem is always rated for where you go for your training or your job. And I think that's a pretty good scale of judgment. When amendments like this come to the floor, I'm insulted because to me, these kind of amendments are just made to kill a good bill.
Anybody else for their first time? Representative Craigo for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and for the amendment. I think we heard the other day, there was quite a bit of testimony about we don't even know where these forms are to opt out. I mean, there was I remember one speaker asking about it and mentioning that they were hidden somewhere on the LSO website, which isn't necessarily true, but I think this gives the opportunity for those that don't want it or don't want to add to the expense, they can simply opt out by approving this amendment and voting however they wish on the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Stivar for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On against the amendment. There is a mechanism already. Every time we go to committee meetings, you check the box, accept, half, expenses. So there's an option out there to refuse it now. On and against the amendment.
Anybody else for their first time? Anybody for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Yin for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So again, I'm for the bill. I'm very for the bill. I think that there was concern that we heard over the course of the 3 readings, and this tries to help address some of those concerns for those members who don't think that it's necessary for themselves, which I heard that it wasn't necessary for themselves. This allows them to withhold that until they so choose that they feel it's necessary. So on and for the amendment. Thank you.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 61 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Third reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 61 has passed. Next amendment. Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw my amendment.
Third reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 61 has been withdrawn. Representative Slagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading amendment number 3 to House or Senate File 61. And the reason I bring this amendment is I feel that in the bill that we're amending kind of takes the authority away from this body at looking at the per diem. And I thought this just brings some accountability back to this body. So I would ask for your favorable vote. Thank you.
Anybody, Chairman Zwanitzer for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess against the amendment, so just to remind everybody, this is all public information the government puts out on what the rates are in the communities. So at any time, you can go look and it gets decided and it co-aligns with the federal fiscal year. So I'm not sure what we'd have the state auditor do we can all do this ourselves. You can go look at the rates, and if we have an issue with following the federal rate, I would think any legislator at any time could bring a bill and set it back in statute. So I think this is just one more thing on the state auditor's office, on the executive branch that's kind of bureaucratic and nothing that we can't do ourselves individually in this body. So without some more testimony on why it's important or needed, I would encourage a no vote on the amendment.
Anybody else? Anybody for their second time before the sponsor? Representative Slagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess the main thing I was looking at, I know that information is available out there, but I guess I don't necessarily trust the federal government. The federal government tends to be out of control on spending sometimes, and if they continue to go that way, this rate could go up higher than we as a state think is necessary. So that's why I brought this. Thank you. Please vote aye.
All those in favor of third reading amendment number 3 to Senate File 61 signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. Third reading amendment number 3 to Senate File 61 has failed. Senate File 61 having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Elliman, Allred, Andrew, Angelos, Banks, Bear, Berger, Brown, Burkhart excused, Byron, Chadwick, Chestick, Clouston, Conrad? Crago? Davis? Eklund? Haroldson? Harshman? Heiner? Henderson? Warnock? Jennings? Knapp? Larson Lloyd? Larson JT? Lawley? Locke? Nyman? Newsom? Nicholas? Nemec? Northrup? Oakley? Obermueller? O'Hearn? Olson? Ottman? Pendergraft? Penn? Provenza? Rodriguez Williams? Sherwood? Singh? Slagle? Smith? Stith? Storer? Strock? Stivar? Tarver? Trujillo? Walters? Ward? Washut? Western? Winter? Wiley? Yin? Zwanitzer Dan? Zwanitzer Dave? Speaker Summers? Are there any changes? Henderson? No to aye. Further changes? Closing vote. Vote closed. 33 aye, 28 no, 1 excused.
Senate File 61, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, Senate File 61 has passed the House. The next bill for our consideration, what do you think, Mr. Majority Floor Leader? Probably time. All right. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move this House stand in recess until 2 p.m.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Committee announcements. Chairman Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee number 8, Transportation, Highways, and Military Affairs will meet in about 15 minutes to go over our last 2 bills. We are going to be doing Senate File 67, Multi-Purpose Vehicles Disabled License Plates, and Senate File 141, Transportation Technology Transfer Center Program Funding. And then we will also be discussing upon that, the ending of those 2, we'll be discussing interim topics for the House side before we go next week.
Chairman Newsom.
Mr. Chairman, your committee number 6, Travel, Recreation, Wildlife, and Cultural Resources, will not be meeting at noon, but we will be getting together for lunch to discuss our lives and our interim topics.
Chairman Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not as riveting of a conversation, but your Joint Conference Committee on House Bill 47, Election Equipment Federal Certification, will meet at 12:30 in room 113 to consider House Bill 47.
Chairman Washut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your committee number 1, Judiciary, will be meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning in our normal room to consider Senate File 181, Senate File 99, Senate File 108, Senate File 80. In your Conference Committee on House Bill 14 will be meeting today at 12:30 as well, down in 110.
Chairman Northrup.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee number 4, Education, will be meeting tomorrow at noon. We're going to hear 3 bills. We're going to start out with Senate File 83, K-12 School Facility Leasing. Senate File 74, which is the Wyoming Charter School Authorizing Board. And as time permits, we'll start into Senate File 132, which is study of K-12 education programming.
Representative Crago.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your Joint Conference Committee number 1 on House Bill 16, State Land Leasing Improvements, will meet immediately upon adjournment in room 113. Thank you.
Chairman Nicholas. Chairman Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your House Appropriations will meet on adjournment to hear Senate File 159, Senate File 172, and Senate File 144.
Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Committee number 10, Labor, Health, Social Services will meet tomorrow at 8:30 to hear Senate File 147. Again, 8:30.
Anybody else? All right, we'll stand in recess until 2 PM.